today's show, we're joined by Paul Buck, CEO and founder of Epic Risk Management, and his colleague Alan Smart, who works alongside Paul as a harm reduction manager. Epic are a global harm reduction consultancy firm specialising in gambling, and they work across a number of sectors. So they're working in education, they're working with the armed forces, and of course they're working in financial services and various others, including elite sports. On today's show, Alan and Paul are going to tell us about their experience working in financial services and also a little bit on their own backstory, having both previously had pathological gambling addictions and having now moved into recovery. Before we start today's show, just a trigger warning, we will be covering some sensitive content today that some listeners may find upsetting, specifically around mental health, addiction, gambling and suicide. Alan, Paul, welcome to the show today. Great to have you here. So yeah, let's just kick off with you, Paul. Just a little bit on your background. You know, what's brought you here and brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us. It's great to be here. So my name is Paul Buck. I'm the CEO of a company called Epic Risk Management. We are a organisation that deals with the prevention of gambling-related harm. So through education, awareness, training, and consultancy services, we go into the highest risk sectors and we prevent or mitigate the risk that gambling can bring to organisations. So there's a bit of a backstory, which I'm sure we'll get into, but fundamentally that's who I am and what we do.
Why don't we just start with that backstory then and just go straight into that? So just to understand, you know, why Epic, why you're doing what you're doing today. I think that's a good starting point.
Okay, so I'll give you the short version. Otherwise, we'd be here a long time. But basically, for the first 18 years of my life, I never gambled at all. So I played a lot of sport growing up with cricket and football, etc. But gambling in those days was a very different beast. You know, I'm 47 years old now, but in those days it was kind of greyhounds, there was horses, and there was a football pool. So that was it. Very different from the kind of beast that gambling is now, with 120 odd markets on every football match and 24/7. But so, you know, I didn't gamble. I then went to Leeds University in 1994. I joined the football team. There was a squad of 16 of us. And really it was then, you know, the other 15 guys, even though gambling was difficult to do back in those days, you know, you could only bet on 3 things. That's all that they ever really did. You know, it wasn't really a drink culture or anything like that. It was more, what bet did you put on? How did it do? What bets you got on this afternoon? And we were going down the bookies, and lasted a few days before I actually went along to a William Hill in Horsforth in Leeds, just near Headingley. And I went in and I placed my first bet of £10 each way on a 33-1 outsider. And, you know, I only picked this horse, in talk of science, I only picked this horse because it was running blue and white. I'm a Preston North End fan. So that was literally as scientific as it was. And if that horse, I think, had done what it should have done and lost, because it had never finished a race, let alone won a race before, you know, that £10 each way at 33-1 probably would have been the only bet they ever placed. It would have reinforced that gambling was a mugs game. But sort of 2 out from the end of that race, it sort of ran back into the screen, going really well. Going over the last, it jumped into the lead and it went off and it won by about 12 lengths. And, you know, you ask why we're here today talking about what Epic do and prevention of harm. I think if that horse had probably lost, I probably wouldn't be sat here. But because it went on and it won, I had that whole dopamine, serotonin, endorphin release that comes from that pleasure. You've got your new mates or teammates sort of patting you on the back, sort of saying, oh, how did you find that one? You're then going over and taking nearly £500 in cash from the same woman you just begrudged giving £20 to a few minutes earlier. Suddenly I was then a gambler. So I wasn't a problem gambler or a gambling addict or anything like that, but I was a gambler. I was on the spectrum of gambling. Probably as an occasional gambler at that point. But the reality was, from that day onwards for 17 years, there wasn't a day after that I didn't place a bet, or certainly not one that I can remember, in some form or other. So that's how quick I went from being someone who had no interest in gambling, you know, never really watched a horse race or anything, to somebody who gambled every single day of their life for 17 years. And I think that just shows how easy it is to sort of get sucked into it a little bit. Now, for 7 of those years, I was completely in control of time, money, cognition, the 3 things that make up the addiction. I was completely in control. I wasn't spending time that I couldn't afford to lose. I wasn't spending money that I couldn't afford to lose. And it wasn't dominating my thoughts first thing in the morning, last thing at night, or throughout the day. And then in 2001, I made 2 big changes, really. One is I got married to Anna. The second one is I decided that I wasn't earning enough money. I wanted to go into a career. I'd gone after university. I'd gone into retail with Littlewoods and Index into retail, working a lot of hours for not much money. And in 2001, I thought, no, right, I need to earn more money. I'm working too hard for what I'm earning. So I got a job in financial services as a financial advisor. And then for 5 years, I turned out to be fairly successful at that. So I got made into a regional manager. And then later on in 2010, I got made into a divisional manager of bank assurance. So, that was an interesting decade where you've got career growing, you've got family growing, because as well as Mary and Anna in 2001, Connor came along in 2004, Rebecca in 2006, and Georgia in 2010. So on the face of it, career was going well, family was growing. What could possibly be going wrong? And the third world that I had going on, which was completely compartmentalized, is I developed a pretty severe gambling addiction that ran alongside those two worlds. And during that decade, I transacted £4.8 million across 93 different betting accounts. I lost £1.3 million, of which nearly £500,000 of it was the tier one banks that I worked for at the time. And fundamentally, the addiction had taken over my mind completely, taken over my life completely. And you always gamble more than you can afford. And even though I was earning good money in the financial services industry, you will always earn more. Could have earned £1 million, I would have gambled too. And I had access to money. I had security access. I had clients who were very trusting of me. And the need to gamble and that vice-like addiction became more than what your moral compass used to be, or the way that you brought up, or anything like that. I started stealing money to the point where it was nearly £500,000 by 2011, when some pretty severe rock bottoms came along. And really, that's where Epic came from. But by all means, we can talk about the rock bottoms in more detail, but that's where Epic came from. How do you stop people going down that same route, that same journey that you've gone down? Where are people most at risk of doing that? What sectors are people most at risk of doing that? And it was really, 2013, after the rock bottoms, I came out and it's right, how do we prevent that harm? And the last 10 years, we celebrate our 10th anniversary at Epic in November. That is what my part of life and everyone who now works for us, including Alan, dedicate our lives to try and prevent that harm happening to others.
Thanks, Paul. And you mentioned rock bottom. It's interesting. We'll come back to that because I'd like to go into that a little bit further and just understand, how low and how bad it can get and how it spirals to that point. But you mentioned Alan there. So, Alan, do you want to just chip in? It'd be good to hear a bit about your backstory as well and what's brought you here with Paul.
Yeah, no worries, Ian. Thanks for inviting us along. So, I'm Alan Smart. I'm a harm prevention manager. Been with Epic Risk for just coming up in 2 years now. Identified a lot of what Paul was saying there. My first two bets won. And it was, I thought I could actually predict the outcome of horses and dogs. Most of my gambling was done in retail space, inside betting shops. And the sort of winnings, those winnings when I had them, it was really to replace feelings that I didn't have when I was growing up. I was never chasing money. It was all about feelings for me. And I sort of quickly spiraled into a gambling addiction, 21-year pathological addiction, a lot of it done in this city that we're in just now. And up until about just over 2 years ago, I was selling commercial tyres, for dumpers, diggers, that kind of thing. Fairly comfortable. And I'd been following Epic across the socials, on and off, just looking at what they were doing, and a position came up. And I thought, I fancy a bit of that because I liked what the message was. It was something that I'd been kind of looking for. And I interviewed on Zoom on the Monday with Dan, who is now Director of Safer Gambling, and he said, right, okay, can you be here on the Wednesday? And I moved a little bit of heaven and earth to get there on the Wednesday, and I got the phone call on the Thursday, Dan saying I would love you on my team. And ever since then, 2 or 3 weeks after that, I was on a plane to Malta, speaking, in front of gambling operators, telling them about how addiction sort of ruined my life. And ever since then, it's just been a complete education. It's just a college of knowledge. I learn as much out of this job as anything. So it feels like I know it sounds quite, it's sort of cheesy or whatever, but it feels like a calling. It feels like when I got this job, something just clicked, and it feels like something that I was looking for.
It's a nice story, and as obviously having walked the path, both of you, you're in a unique position to be able to advise and support others. How bad did it get for yourself? We heard some of the numbers there from Paul, but what about you, Alan? I mean, I used to work with you, and I had no idea that any of this was going on. I don't know if other people that you worked with did. It's, you know, how bad does it get, and how secretive can you be over that sort of stuff before the other people tend to see it and so on?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I remember when we worked together, and you know, I'd just come out of recovery about that time, and it got, you know, Paul speaks about rock bottoms. The thing with sort of when you're, you know, sort of out there performing, as we call it, and you've got this almost like a gambling career. Every time I thought I'd hit my rock bottom, there was a trap door down to another level, another gutter level, if you like, until I actually hit my actual rock bottom. And it got to the point where I, you know, one lunchtime, I decided I'd had enough, and I didn't want to be here anymore. You know, not too far from here, every lunchtime I would go to Gordon Street. Well, there's a row of betting shops, and I would go in there, and I would spend my whatever money I had in there, and it was always late back from my lunch, you know, and my manager, Kev, he'd be like, "Where were you?" And I could never come forward, because I had this thing when I was growing up that I kept stuff in, and you know, things like that. People think you sort of shed some skin when you hit 18, 19. Well, you don't. You keep a lot of your childlike stuff in. So I felt as I couldn't tell anybody. And you know, you talk about sort of financial services. I remember in those betting shops, and I knew a lot of them by name. There were guys in there suited and booted, displaying the very same characteristics that I had. I've seen form guides being ripped off the wall, pens getting thrown, and I've always wondered, like, when they went back to their work, because a lot of them worked for major financial organisations, how did that play out? How productive were they? Because I know what I was like. You know, you talk about how bad did it get. You know, when I was gambling, my you know, every lunchtime I would go back and I couldn't lift my head. I couldn't make a call. I couldn't see a customer. Because I felt so down, just worrying about how am I going to get more money to gamble. Because I was at the point where when I was in the bookies, my feet were nailed to the floor. I couldn't move, and that I seen that being replicated by other people in that space. So that's how bad it got for me. When eventual you know, decision that you know, self-destruction was a better option than going on how I was. Yeah.
And again, you've mentioned financial services, and we'll come back to that, but we'll stick with the rock bottom for now. So yourself, Paul, do you just want to talk to us a little bit about what that looked like for yourself? And
yeah, so you know, I don't think my case was typical. We've got sort of 24 guys and girls now who work for us who've all been at the real rock bottom of gambling addiction, and it's quite interesting, really, because you know, a lot of the stories are the same but different. You know, there's similar sort of trends, or there's similar sort of events and things like that, but they're also completely different in terms of why people were gambling, why they weren't, and so on. And what you see with a lot of the stories, both within Epic and wider, is there's been a lot of people trying to give up, not being able to, and relapse as part of their recovery journey, etc. Mine was completely different. I did the gamblers thing, really, in terms of training my brain that actually gambling's not the problem. Everything else is a problem. You know, Anna became the problem, the kids became the problem, the weather became the problem, the bank that I worked for became the problem, you know, the traffic jam on the M6 became the problem. Everything else was a problem, and gambling was actually the answer to those problems. That was my coping mechanism. That was my sort of safety zone. So I hadn't had a decade of gambling addiction where I've been trying to give up and knew I had a problem. I actually didn't think I had a problem at all. I thought everything else was the problem. But that sort of changed towards the end of the decade, and really the trigger moment came for me was around the Gary Speed, death in 2011. It kind of shocked the sporting world, but also the wider world, because Gary had a 20-year career with Everton and Newcastle and Leeds, amongst other teams. He was doing fantastically well as the Wales national manager at the time. And he had everything going for him, great family, great kids and everything. And then suddenly the news broke in the third week of November 2011 that Gary had gone out after being on Football Focus with some ex-teammates. He'd gone back to his house and he'd gone into his garage next door, and he'd taken his own life, by suicide. And his wife found him the following morning. And, you know, that was covered in an article in The Independent a few days later, 2 or 3 days later. And it was sort of saying, you know, why would Gary have done that? He had everything going for him. There must be some kind of reason. You know, did he have financial problems, relationship problems, etc., and all different synopses. But one of them was written by somebody who runs a gambling clinic down in London, and she said, could he have had a gambling problem? Gambling and sport, the relationship was just starting to be identified. Something we work with quite closely now, obviously, but, could he have had a gambling problem? If he was, this is what would have happened. He would have gambled till every penny had gone. He'd gamble 24 hours a day. He wouldn't really care about family, friends, his work, or anything like that. All he'd really be concerned about would probably be the next bet that he had on, or the bet that he already had on. And it wasn't a long article, it was a fairly short one, but it was something that resonated in my brain that nothing ever had before. It's something that triggered something in my brain. And it was a hard copy of the newspaper. It wasn't like now where you've got the kind of, everyone reads the news on the phones or whatever. So I kept putting the paper down, but I kept reading it. I kept picking it up again and reading it. And I even took it out of my office and went and took it down to the sort of kitchen or whatever. But I kept needing to read this article. I think something was going on in my brain, a kind of epiphany moment or realization moment. And quite soon, I got to the point where I realized that whilst it turns out she wasn't talking about Gary, and I must stress, Gary didn't have a gambling problem, who she was actually describing and talking about was me. And, that became a very difficult thing for me to try and deal with. And, I phoned my wife that night and I just said, look, I need to get away for a few days. That wasn't unusual because with the work that I was doing with the bank, I was often in Scotland or Isle of Man or Northern Ireland or anywhere. So it wasn't unusual to her. But I said, I just need to go and spend some time away. So she presumed it was working, but in reality, what I did on that day in November 2011 is I replaced the addiction to gambling with the addiction to studying gambling and researching gambling. What's this thing that's beaten me? And I toured all the libraries of the north of England. I got in my car and I drove to Newcastle. And I went from Newcastle to Leeds to Manchester. I just read everything that I could ever find written about gambling addiction. What's this thing that's beaten me? And I had this whole realization moment. And the truth is I probably had a bit of a breakdown, a bit of a mental breakdown, because, things like normality started flooding back in, normal thoughts started flooding back in and everything else. And, sure enough, on December the 8th, 2011, I had to be back in my regional office back in Preston. It was my turn to kind of hold the regional managers meeting. So I had to be there. I had my PA phoning me left, right and centre saying, why you're not here, etc. So I knew I had to be back that day, and something got me back there. And in that morning, we did the usual things. We talked about tax year end, which was coming up a few months later. We talked about the Grand Prix, which we're one of the sponsors of. And so we did the normal things, that you would do at a meeting like that. And then at lunchtime, pretty much unsolicited really and unplanned, I sort of, I don't want to call it a calling, but I had this huge urge to not be here anymore. That's how low it got for me. I think there's always generally a rock bottom, and for me it was that lunchtime of December the 8th, 2011, and I hadn't written a note or anything like that, but I sort of went from my office, which was on the middle floor of the building where I was based, and I went up to a top floor of there, which was an unused store cupboard. And my intention, quite frankly, was to open the window and jump out the window onto the pavement below. I'd convinced myself that the world would be a better place without me. I was convinced that the bank I worked for, my wife, my kids, everybody would be better off without me. And I think it was probably, 10 days of fatigue, 10 days of not really eating, and 10 days of having this huge realization, studying everything that I'd studied. But, I'd very much made the decision that I'd be better off for everybody if I wasn't here. I was very fortunate that the window was kind of silicon shut, so I couldn't open the window. So I did what, for me at the time, felt the next best thing, and I took off my tie. I hung it up on a beam that was in the ceiling in that storeroom, and I stood up on a chair and put my head through the noose, and I very much intended not being here. And I came round about 3 hours later. I'd obviously fallen out of the ligature, if you like, and I'd cracked my head on the floor. It was all cut open, and so on. My glasses were smashed, my suit was ripped. I had no idea where I was. I'd never been in that room before and since. And I sort of like came round a little bit. It was just going dark outside, which is how I knew it had been so long. And I managed to stagger through sort of Preston town centre as it was then, city centre as it is now. Got in my car and drove all the way to my mum's house, sort of 12 miles somehow. And basically then changed my mum's life forever. Rather than being Paul, the one who's got a great financial services career, great family, Must have all the money in the world, got a great job, all right, he doesn't talk to us as much as he used to, all right, he's put a bit of weight on, but, he's got this high-powered job, why wouldn't he? Now it's Paul, the one who's, got a pretty severe gambling addiction, huge amount of debt, almost 7 figures of debt, and he's just tried to kill himself at work. So not an easy conversation to have with your mum. And then I needed to go an hour later and have the same conversation with my wife and basically tell her that our whole married life, I'd had this third world going on that she was completely not aware of. And the output of it was that, we've got £1 million worth of debt. This is what I tried to do at work earlier today. And it's probably worse to come when I go back into work tomorrow and tell them how I came across some of that money. So 2 incredibly difficult conversations to have in that period of time. And, looking back now, it almost feels like I'm talking about someone else, but this time sort of 12 years ago, if you like, 11 or 12 years ago, those were experiences that I went through. And, sure enough, I told work the following morning, gave them the whole bank of evidence that went with it. I had 6 months on bail, and then on June the 29th, 2012, I got sentenced at Preston Crown Court to 32 months in prison for 16 counts of fraud, totaling £434,000. So I went away for 11 and a half months of that, missed a year of my kids growing up, missed a year of my marriage, careers obviously over in financial services, and so on. So pretty big rock bottoms. And it was really in there, and I went to HMP Preston and then HMP Kirkham. It was really in there that I had that decision to make. Do you go out there and get a job and do what you need to do to look after your family on release 12 months later? Or do you go out there and actually try and stop this happening to other people? And that was a decision I made very quickly. And then working in the library, I had about 10 months to put a business plan together, work out what I wanted to do, what's the best way of preventing this happening to people, who do you get involved in that, where do you go and work? And really that's June the 13th, 2013, I came out and started the journey.
Wow, it's really deep, really dark and low points as well. Obviously there's been a positive road back, and it's good to see that you're supporting others now. I think like the most frightening thing for me in all of that is that it can get that low and spiral that quickly and that deep without other people noticing it. So I guess one of the things is that is the stigma around gambling. So one of the questions is, why does that stigma exist? But also, like, why do you think it can get to that point without people noticing it? Those people like so close to you in your family, and so yeah, how can it get that low? And I suppose on the flip side of that, what can be done to counter that, to stop it happening to others?
Yeah, so the stigma, it's not a competition between different addictions, but I almost felt when I came out with my addiction, it would have been easier if I came out years ago, if it had been alcohol or drug misuse, because these things are substance addictions, substance abuse, where you put something into your body, but this is more a psychological and emotional addiction. And I just always felt that if I went to anybody and said, listen, I've got a gambling addiction, probably at that time most people would say, well, a gambling addiction? Well, look after your money better, just stop doing it. Well, I wish I'd thought of that, and it might have worked. So it was, yeah, there's a lot of stigma, and a lot of it still, we're still trying to smash through that stigma, Ian, as well. It's, if I go to my local GP today, I'll see there'll be flyers on the wall for all sorts of recovery places for maybe alcoholics or people with misuse with drugs, but there's none really there for gambling, and it's kept away. And there is a reason that there's more suicides through gambling addiction than other addictions, because people keep it inside because of the stigma, and they keep it inside till they get to the point where they feel that weight of judgment is so heavy that there's nothing else, there's nowhere else to turn apart from, I'm just gonna check out of life, because I cannot bring myself to tell people that I've these terrible things that I've done with the money that you should be spending for think your kids' education, clothes, entertainment, all that kind of thing. There's a lot of stigma around it, as I say, that still exists today, but I'm not sure Paul can expand on it as well.
I think the stigma exists anyway with other addictions as well. It's not just gambling. It's there's maybe a bit of a grey area about it. I think it's once you confront that stigma with yourself, your own experience, once you've actually finally faced up and had those difficult conversations, is the point where you finally actually able to break through, recover, and then progress from there. So like you said, it's about helping people to smash that stigma. I think the thing with gambling is it's a bit of a grey area. Like we looked at some of the stats before we sat down today, like 26% people in the UK have gambled every 4 weeks. So I'll put myself in that bracket. I've got an app on my phone. I'll sit, I'll watch the football. I'll have a coupon on. I'll maybe have 2 or 3 if there's a couple of games on an afternoon and stuff. So I suppose it's like that grey area of when does gaming and gambling go from something that's entertainment to something that becomes a problem as well. And I think it's how do organisations spot that as well? If we're talking about here financial services, other sectors, how do individuals, but also how do organisations and workplaces spot that sort of stuff?
Yeah, no, 100%. And one thing that we're very aware of is Epic are not anti-gambling in any way. You know, we've got 24 people who've suffered pretty severe harm from gambling or have, you know, been at rock bottom with it. But you know, we are very aware that 70% of the population gamble, you know, if you include the National Lottery. We're very aware that, you know, 97 or 98% of people can gamble and stay in control of time, money, cognition. And it is a leisure pursuit. It's not the same as drugs or something. It's a legal leisure pursuit for most, but most can stay in control with. It's just that small percentage is still a very significant number of people. And when you do get the level of harm that you can get with a most severe form of gambling addiction, then it can have devastating effects, not just to the person, but those around them. And, you know, Alan touched on stigma, and there is a huge stigma. There is around a number of addictions, as you quite rightly said. But with gambling, I think there's almost an increased one. You know, blokes in particular are now happy to talk about mental health because there's been so many campaigns around sport and other areas. You know, but we've got people in our team who had cross addictions and co-addictions, and they actually came out and admitted the other addictions, be it to drink or alcohol, but not the gambling one. So there is still that stigma, and I think a lot of it links to that kind of hidden addiction. It's well known and called as a hidden addiction, and I think the reason for that, I've just told you sort of an element of my story, and I kept it hidden for 10 years without anybody knowing. If I'd been the equivalent drug addict, I think I'd have been a heroin user. You know, if I'd have been the equivalent alcoholic, I think I would have been a meth drinker or neat alcohol drinker. Now, there's only so long I would have been able to do that without the physical symptoms starting to show. You know, you can tell someone who's using heroin or is drinking meth. Whereas with gambling, it is a psychological and behavioural addiction. So that's why it can sometimes go undetected for longer. And because it's gone undetected for longer, and there is a financial element of it as well, usually the rock bottoms can be quite hard. And it usually ends up in shame. I can't get out of this hole, and that's why you tend to have a lot of suicide attempts or criminality or whatever that goes alongside it. So it's complex. You know, it's not a simple thing. We always wish we could go around with a box of, you know, pills or something, whatever, and give everybody one where we go and do our talks and say, look, if you get a gambling problem, or if anybody else does, give them that pill, it'll be all right. You know, but it doesn't work like that. It's incredibly complex in terms of the root cause, the triggers, and everything else. So yeah, I think stigma, hidden addiction, you know, you'll see that a lot if you study gambling addiction. It's what we kind of use as part of our work every day.
Cool. If we go back to financial services as well, then I think I just want to understand why certain sectors are more of a risk than others. Clearly financial services is. You mentioned one thing, obviously access to money was a big thing for yourself, Paul, but you Alan, you said that you'd see a lot of people from that sort of sector in the bookies when you were in and stuff, so it can't just be access to money. They were gambling their own money. So what else makes the financial services sector of particular interest to yourself?
Yeah, I think, you know, reading upon the different evidence that's out there, we know about 24% of people who present themselves at one of the NHS clinics, for instance, comes from the financial services sector. So it's by far, in a way, the sector that's got the biggest problem with gambling of any. People will always link sport, they'll always link maybe things like the armed forces, criminal justice, you know, other places like that we work. But financial services, if you look at it statistically and evidentially, does have the biggest problem. Now, it's not everybody. It's not everybody particularly who works in a branch and opens savings accounts or things like that. It's your risk takers. So you talk about your traders, you talk about your, you know, people like who work in investment banking and so on. So people who are inherently taking risk every day. And there's some pretty high level examples of that in it if you look at it. You know, and so, you know, financial services institutions are expecting you to come in, take risk every day, earn the bank a lot of money or earn the institution a lot of money. But then you're expected to turn off that risk profile when you leave work and just go home and, you know, watch the telly or whatever. It just doesn't work. Once risk has taken over your brain, if you like, or taken over your thought processes, it's very difficult to do that. So what a lot of people in financial services do, and the evidence suggests, is they will go home and they'll carry on with that risk profile into individual betting accounts or individual trading accounts or things like that. So there's definitely that risk element. There is the access to money. You know, for me, quite frankly, if I'd been, you know, during the height of the addiction, if you could gamble in washing up liquid bottles, or you could gamble in, you know, tins of tuna, I would have been just as happy, you know, finding myself a lorry load of tuna or a lorry load of washing up liquid bottles. I would have had exactly the same feeling. But of course, you don't. Gambling currency is cash, and I had access to it. You know, and yeah, you know, perhaps it shouldn't have been easy as it was, but I did have access to money. Now others don't have that, so what they will start doing is selling drugs or stealing cars or whatever. But you know, it gets to the point with gambling where the need to place the next bet is more important to you than where you get the money from. And that's why it's particularly, I think, a problem within financial services, because you are trusted with people's money, and you do have access to it as well. So add that to the risk element, and you can start to see where the perfect storm comes for somebody who is going to suffer a gambling problem.
And then maybe if we just touch on the technology side of things as well, obviously, so we talk a lot about technology and its application within financial services, emerging trends, all that sort of stuff. What about around the gambling sector, the emergence of technology, new technologies, accessibility, all that sort of stuff? What sort of an impact is that having on the sector and on gambling behaviours, and what risks come along with that?
Yeah, so you will find, you know, we're in a world where the latest phone is on its way at any given time, and with that comes the increase in tech, and it's moving at lightning speed. We are years ahead of where we're kind of meant to be with that tech, and you know, it's no exaggeration to say now that you have a bookmakers in your back pocket, i.e. your phone. So when I spoke earlier, Ian, about meeting, you know, guys in the bookies that were doing their brains in gambling, they don't need to do that now. Just before I left, one of the places where I worked in the city, internet gambling was just coming in, and I would go into the toilet and be in the toilet for 10 minutes, lock the cubicle door and gamble. And depending on the outcome of that bet or those bets, I would come out like, you know, my face tripping me, not being able to lift my head, or I'd come out like really hot and somebody would say, what's up? You've just been to the toilet. It couldn't have been that good. And it's just those behaviours, he spoke about it earlier, you know, what kind of signs of harm. It's that the behavioural stuff is usually stuff that sticks out, but it's a huge thing, and you know, we are, wherever there is gambling harm, gambling related harm, we will try and, you know, we will meet that, but we are in that world where it is moving at an incredible speed. The way people are gambling is changing. We're now into VR. You can slap a headset on a VR and you can be in a casino. You know, and that's really appealing to some people. When I discovered internet gambling, I always thought there's a casino not too far from here. I always thought you had to be posh to go in there, and I didn't want to go in. That was eradicated with internet, because the casino then came to me. I didn't have to go into the casino; it all came to me, and that's what I did. I went home, and I could stick to. No longer would I have to phone my partner and say, "Listen, I'm working late." When I was actually in the bookies, I would come home, I'd do a 9 to 5 like everybody else. She was happy with that, and I'd come home, throw the laptop up, and I'd start gambling. Tech was here, and it was an absolute, moved my gambling onto a different stratosphere. Don't know about Paul, but I can imagine.
What about the flip side of it then? So obviously there's a lot of risks, as you say, in the accessibility, as we've mentioned. What are we seeing around technology to monitor people's behaviours, things that you do? And so you can create your own settings and stuff online when you're gambling and that sort of stuff. But is there enough happening in that space with the AI and that type of thing to look at people's data and to tackle it? Or is that more of a tick box exercise for the gambling companies? How do you see that?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I think, you know, it presents its problems, online gambling, but it also presents an opportunity to be able to track it in a regulated market. So, you know, when online gambling came on, I always look back to that first bet I placed, that £10 each way in cash at William Hill in 1994. And if I was going to go and place my first bet now, you'd more than likely do it on your phone. And you would do it as a figure in the screen rather than a bank transfer, rather than cash, tangible nature of it. So it became 24/7. It became less tangible because you're not dealing with cash, you're dealing with a figure in a screen. You're dealing it with 24/7, and you're dealing with it. It's confidential now, isn't it? You can do it without anybody seeing you doing it. When I was gambling, you had to go into a bookies between 9 and 5 and pay in cash. And when the bookie's shut, you couldn't gamble anymore, really. So it completely changed it. And if you add into that in-play betting, cash in and cash out, what that does, it sort of keeps you involved in the bet all the way through. So rather than just putting your bet on at the start of a horse race, you know, you couldn't then do anything with that until the horse had run. It's either won or it's lost, and you go and collect your winnings or you throw your slip away. With cash in and cash out, you can take money 3 furlongs in or 4 furlongs in or 67 minutes into a football match, and you can take a proportion of the winnings at that point. So you're involved in the betting all the time, and that really exacerbates the addiction quicker because you're constantly thinking about it. So, you know, it does provide a lot of risks. There's no doubt about it, and it's certainly changed my betting life as well. But you are quite right. We're dealing with certain operators now who are using that technology to basically, the algorithms that go with it, to basically identify problem play or identify people who are gambling problematically, maybe a change of behaviours. There's something like 26 or 27 markers of harm, which they can pick up and they can intervene there and then, real time, and so on. So, you know, unless a person in the betting shop had seen me gambling problematically, they wouldn't have known that. Now with online gambling, with the algorithms, the tech, the tools that are in place, like deposit limits, timeouts, things like that, it is an opportunity to identify players who are showing that harm or showing those signs and intervene, if not real time, almost immediately. So it is an opportunity as well, and that's sometimes lost, I think, in some of the arguments and narratives that are out there at the moment.
Doesn't really feel like a long-term solution, though, does it? It sort of like turns you off, but it's not going to deal with the problem. Let's talk about the solutions a little bit then. Keen to hear more about some of the specifics around the work that Epic are doing, especially around financial services, but also keen to hear some of your recommendations and ideas about what can be done more as an industry and by individuals within the workplace as well. So sort of what do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, and I think it's important to, like, Epic's firmly entrenched in the preventative side of, you know, gambling related harm. So stopping somebody before they fall off that proverbial cliff. There is a tipping point where when someone is a pathological gambler, they then need third party recovery. So, you know, and between prevention and recovery, we're in that preventative space, and it's so important. A lot of the work we do is around education. It's just educating people. You spoke earlier about, Ian, you know, that stigma is bring that stigma, dragging it out into the light, and having that frank conversation about gambling and those signs of harm that Paul spoke about. You know, let's dig into that. Let's bring those signs of harm out. Let's talk about it. And a lot of the work that I do specifically with Epic is working with gambling operators. And, you know, when we go and we tell our story from the sort of addict side, you know, there's a lot of sort of jaws hit the floor because there's a lot of light bulb moments. You know, having loads of data there is one thing, but then, you know, how do you interact with that data? What do you do with that data? How do you make someone's customer experience a bit safer? And it's educating them on these tools and, you know, things like deposit curfews. Unfortunately, you'll never pick up the paper or go on the internet and read safer gambling department saves man's life. That's not going to happen. You'll read the other stuff, but there's you know, safer gambling departments in a lot of the major operators now, and people don't even know about that, or they might dismiss it. But we see the work that's been done, the feedback we get's fantastic. We've seen emotions in the room, the people that we work with. So again, to me, it all comes down to education. You get the prevention right, then theoretically, you know, the other side of recovery, there shouldn't be as much of that. But I don't know if Paul wants to.
Yeah, I mean, when was working out what to do with Epic, it was very much the thing that seemed to be missing was there's some really good treatment places out there. So Gam Cares of this world and Sporting Chance of this world that Tony Adams set up and so on. But there was nobody, so when somebody fell off the edge of that proverbial cliff that Alan talks about, there was loads of people to pick them up and try and make them better and try and get them back up the cliff. But there was nobody back in 2013 who was trying to do that education and preventative piece to try and stop people getting to the edge of a cliff in the first place. So that's where Epic came from: education, prevention, identification, control. And, you know, you then start thinking, well, where do you work and how do you do it? Which is really the question you've just asked. And so we wanted to work statistically and evidentially with those sectors that displayed the most harm. So professional sport, you know, we do a lot of work with pro sport now. Kids, so we work with between 50 and 60,000 kids every year, age 14 plus, it has to be age appropriate. And actually go and tell that preventative message the same as they get with alcohol, drugs, stranger danger, body image, all the different things that you get taught at school. The armed forces, where you're trying to replicate being in combat in many cases and dealing with PTSD, and gambling becomes a way of dealing with that. Criminal justice system itself, so it's one of the fastest growing reasons that people go to prison. but there's an awful lot of people in prison who develop gambling problems due to boredom or bullying or things like that. And then the other one, which, you know, surprises people when we've had problems ourselves in terms of the people within Epic, is the gambling industry itself. But we see that, other than maybe working with the kids and the preventive message there, the next generation, the stuff with the gambling operators is really important, because what better way to stop harm at source than actually work from the boardroom down of these operators and advise them on things like the tone of their advertising, their free bet offers, the pernicious nature of some of the products. So you're stopping harm at source if you can influence that way. So, you know, we've got kind of 3 or 4 main offerings, really. Education and awareness is one of them. So that would obviously be for schools, academies of sport, sports players, sports teams, and so on. You've got training, which will be much more where Alan and his team fit in, training the gambling operators, the people who make the conversations and make the calls with the players within the industry every day. And then you've got that consultancy and really trying to help with the strategy and consultancy from sports governing bodies to bank CEOs to and boards to, you know, prison systems to government and so on. So this is how you really prevent things. It's not one silver bullet. There's got to be different ways that you've got to be able to do it with different audiences. And I think that's what we've worked so hard for over the last 10 years, to try and prevent this harm happening to other people.
And is that happening in silos? Are you seeing leaders from different industries coming together to collaborate with the gambling institutions? Are you seeing leaders from different financial institutions? Are they coming together to collaborate, or is it happening more in a one-to-one consultancy? And what's the sort of the route forward? I'm particularly interested in financial services, obviously, but what can that does it look like, or what could it look like?
I think it builds in momentum. You know, the main thing that the financial services and the banks in particular have done well in the last 2 or 3 years has been the kind of blocks, you know, the financial blocks. So if somebody wants to stop gambling transactions on their account, most of the major banks can now give you a financial block where they won't allow them. What I would say, though, if I'm being completely honest, of those 6 sectors that we've just talked about, which are the highest risk, and we've already said financial services probably got the biggest problem of all, they've probably been the least proactive about it, if the truth be known. I won't name or shame here now, but we've worked with certain banks to a small level in the UK, but already in the US over the last 12 months, we've done more work in the US for what's a very nascent market as it opens state by state than we've done in the last 10 years in the UK. And I think a lot of it is around the reputational risk, around the brand risk and things like that. If a bank suddenly, you know, starts admitting or taking ownership for problems with gambling, and then suddenly, you know, investor confidence might get hit, is my money safe in that bank, and so on. And the difference between the two regulators, between the gambling regulator and the financial regulator, is completely different. So the gambling commission is holding the operators very stringently to account about what are you doing and what are you not doing. Whereas the financial regulator is not really giving the duty of care to the banks. But in reality, if you look at my situation, I had £4.8 million go through 93 different betting accounts. I had £4.8 million go through one bank account. So who would really have known that I had a gambling problem? The bank or the gambling operators, if you put it that way. So there is so much that they can do, and so far to this point, they haven't really done enough on it, in my opinion. It is starting to change. I think eventually the regulator will hold them to account more. They do know who the gamblers are because they do it with lending decisions. You know, if you've got a lot of gambling transactions, you won't get a mortgage or things like that. So they know who the gamblers are and the ones who suffer harm. And I think that duty of care is probably round the corner.
I suppose there's an opportunity around open finance with all that as well, and wider access to people's data, giving more insights around that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up soon. Just close off just around some advice maybe to people listening in today, either to organisations or to individuals, if you just want to leave one key takeaway.
Yeah.
Piece of advice you could give to anyone.
Yeah, a lot of people, you know, we all have gut feelings at one time or another. And, you know, I've spoke to colleagues that worked with me, and they said, you know, I knew there was something wrong. I knew there was something up, but I just couldn't ask you about it. Just make yourself, if you feel that somebody, maybe one of your colleagues has maybe got a problem with gambling, or really, you know, just make yourself available. You know, I'm here to talk, just let you know if there's anything that's bothering you. You know, you can speak to me. There are signs of harm in a lot of these financial institutions. I've mentioned a couple today, been late back and, just been moody and all that stuff. And nobody ever guessed it was gambling with me. They might have thought other things, but it was never gambling. So, the quicker we can educate, financial, that sector, the better really, because that leads into sort of preventing that harm. So the advice I would give is just keep an open mind round about this addiction or illness, whatever you want to call it. It's there, it's living, it's breathing. There's a lot of money gets moved about financial sector, so people, there is a lot of risk, and just be aware of it. It's what we're doing this is raising awareness within this sector. Just like by the way, there are people in your sector right now that are gambling, that have gambling related harm, and just be aware of that.
Yeah, I'd leave a bit of advice. One bit of advice for each, for both organisations and then for people. For organisations, is don't think it's not happening where you are. All the evidence suggests that 1 in 30 people in normal risk sectors would statistically or consistently gamble more than they can realistically afford. In high risk sectors such as financial services, that could be as high as 1 in 6. So if you've got 1 in 6 people, that doesn't mean you've got 1 in 6 people who are gambling addicts or problem gamblers, but if you've got 1 in 6 people who consistently gamble more than they can realistically afford and it isn't addressed, they will become people who have problems with gambling. And with that will come financial risk, reputational risk, let alone the human risk to that individual as well. So don't put your head in the sand. Don't think it's not happening to you. Make sure, we're not saying it doesn't have to be epic. It's not a sales pitch, this. But, go and get that education, understand what those risks are, and make sure that you're putting those proactive things in place to stop it. And really, more importantly, in many ways, is to the individual. So if anybody's watching this who does have a gambling problem or thinks, actually, that's turned a light bulb, he's talking about me, that's the kind of thing that I do or whatever, if you're on that journey, then don't keep it to yourself. The one piece of advice we always give to anybody is if you know that this is becoming a problem to you and you are gambling more time or money than you can afford to, or it's starting to dominate your mind processes, then talk to somebody. Yeah. Because there will be nothing good by keeping it internalized. I did it for 10 years and look where I ended up. So those would be my advice to an organization or to an individual.
Yeah. Some really powerful messages at the end there, really impactful. Great discussion. So thanks both for coming along. It was very educational. I think just raising that awareness, it certainly isn't something that was on my radar prior to speaking to yourself. So it's definitely something that is bubbling over in the background. So great to bring it to the forefront for everyone. And I think, even if we just help one person off the back of this discussion today, that it's job done. So thanks both for coming along.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Hopefully have you back again soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.